Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/WeHaveWays. Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland for your Second World War podcasting needs. And we're in my kitchen today, Jim, which is actually...
We are. This is Debrief.
Where we recorded the first episode of We Have Ways of Making You Talk.
Didn't we talk about Hitler?
I think we did talk about Hitler, and I think we talked about radios, and I got out my paperweight, my Spitfire paperweight, and maybe the Tiger Optic I've got that Rob Schaefer gave me. Yeah. And you brought your radio. Happy days, innocent times. And absolutely no conception that four and a half years later, 5 years later,
we're basically because we started in time.
I know.
We're almost in time for conscription in England 80 years ago. and we followed it through.
Gott in Himmel.
But actually, I was just thinking today as we were going through. So what happens? Next year we got 1945 and kind of sort of catch up from stuff that we haven't covered in 1944. Mm-hmm. Then it's kind of we're back to.
Will we get 3 years off without any anniversaries?
Well, do we just do the anniversaries anyway in case we're not there in 3 years' time?
I don't know. It's a
because
question.
I was thinking, because I've got to talk about the Battle of Britain tonight.
Yeah,
and I was thinking we've got to do in depth on that, surely.
Have we not already?
Not really.
We did a kind of four-part.
Did we?
I think we did, Jim. I think we did.
Well, I'm going to stick my neck on the line and say I think it's worth revisiting.
Fair. Okay. So last week we were in Normandy. You got out there on the Monday or the Sunday night, didn't you? And then I joined you on Wednesday morning, and then we all went home on Thursday night together.
Yes.
So we were there. You were there, like... 5 whole quadrants longer than the Prime Minister.
So we're recording this on the 10th of June, D+4. This is going to go out after the election, so presumably he's going to be the ex-Prime Minister then. Mm. But the last thing I'm going to say on this
I have invited him to the festival. If he's free.
If he wants to kind of catch up a bit.
He'll be free.
But well, he will be free, yeah. Unless he's already gone to LA. But my point is twofold. Is first of all, obviously, it just shows a sort of shattering lack of political judgment.
Yeah.
But secondly, there's a sort of bigger thing here, which is actually that hovering in the background, and I did quite a lot of interviews. I know you did as well, but I did quite a lot of interviews last week. And all the interviews I did, which weren't from British media, all focused on Ukraine and what this says about the current situation and is this 1938 and all the rest of it. That was the focus. And as far as I'm concerned, I remember talking to a bunch of people about 2 months ago, saying this is what needs to come out of D-Day. This is a point where we go, this is what you can do when you pull together and, go to a common, you focus on a common cause and all the rest of it. And the fact that he didn't pick that up as this opportunity.
But it ties down on the election, isn't it? To the point of...
But you've got to be bigger than that. You've got to be beyond that.
But also to the point of... But this judgment also to the point of not realising that it'd be absolute... Yes, he has to go back to campaign for an election, but being absent damages your election campaign far more than any gain of sticking... Anyway.
I did think it was incredibly poignant. I thought it was... The service...
Well, it was beautifully done.
The service at the British Memorial was just... I was in bits half of that time. Yeah. I mean, I just kept having to kind of sort of dab my eyes surreptitiously, which wasn't very surreptitious at all because Paddy O'Connell picked up on it immediately.
Yeah.
Some of the comments that those veterans came up with, that chap Cecil Newton saying that ever since he felt shrouded in a coat of sorrow. I mean,
well, what I thought was really interesting about it as well, that because Johnny Flynn sang and Tom Jones sang, it didn't feel like a Vera Lynn event. It felt contemporary. It made how they feel about the war feel contemporary rather than distant. It made it feel like a thing that still lives, that still can be interpreted through art and song and music and reminiscence in a way that a thing with Vera Lynn which pins it in the 40s rather than pins it in a present. Because after all, it was those veterans present we were talking about. Their present's gone by, but you know what I mean?
Yes.
And there's no more present moment than landing on a beach on the morning of D-Day.
Yes, I don't really understand nostalgia for the 1940s. I understand kind of respect for it, and I understand kind of sort of sometimes you think, some of the values that people had then are different to what they are today, and there's certain aspects of that which I really like. There's obviously lots of aspects of 1940s Britain that are kind of pretty abhorrent by today's standards.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's fine, but I think being nostalgic is not the right word. And what I felt a very profound sense of wistfulness.
Yeah,
I would say. Obviously I've been living with these veterans for kind of 20 odd years, and they're all going, and I always feel that, particularly when there's one that I know. But seeing these guys, they're so old, and most of them who was speaking were obviously incredibly articulate.
Yeah.
And that chap who talked about his friend Gummy stood up and did that kind of eulogy to him, and he died at the Battle of Hotto, which is, I've walked all over because of the Sherwood Rangers and stuff. Actually, I walked over a bunch of mostly IC people the other day, a few weeks back. But it was really, really touching, and I loved all the razzmatazz of it. You sort of, you slightly kind of raise your eyebrows at all the Jeeps and stuff. But actually, I don't know why I was raising eyebrows at it. I thought they were great.
I think the P in PIR often stands for pies or pensioner. There were one or two people who wouldn't have got out the door of a Dakota, but that's all right. I mean, part of the sort of Band of Brothers legacy is that a load of people are remembering and have been exposed to it that perhaps wouldn't have done. So that's all right. The other thing I was really touched by, so when we went up to Hillman, up to Colville, Montgomery, the ceremony there was Anglo-French, without that being a thing at all. Then similarly, Hill 112, when we ran into the people looking after Hill 112 there, the French side is completely, yes, we must do this. Let's make sure this happens.
Yeah.
And the mayor at Colville, Montgomery was he'd have been in his early 40s. He was a good 10, 15 years younger than me, but as invested in it as anyone else. Mm-hmm. And that there is a sense amongst the French there that this was a liberation, and it feels a million miles from Where's Your Sodding Poppy, that feeling here.
Yes. It's interesting because I remember
divorced from that, and it feels realistic about liberation and the price of liberating Europe from Nazism in a way that why aren't you wearing your sodding poppy seems to have nothing to do with any of that. You know what I mean? And I do wear my sodding poppy, but I don't agree with that mindset of being a bully about it or being pushy about it. And I think when you stand in that huge, we went to Pegasus Bridge on the night of the 5th, the vast crowd of people there. And yes, it was full of paratroopers and soldiers of various, associations, so some sappers and some rifles people. But it was a French crowd. And it's a French crowd there to celebrate their liberation and to commemorate their liberation. And everyone has a beer and it's fireworks, but what are they there for? They're not there because it's bonfire night. And there were a lot of Dutch people at Arromanches. When you were at the ceremony, there was a thing with the Dutch government at Arromanches on the parade ground there, because there was a Dutch battalion on D-Day. And there were lots of French people there, and it just feels, it's so touching and vivid and real how the contemporary French people feel about this, that it's part of of Normandy's heritage as much as things. You go to the south of France, they don't care. But you go to Normandy, it's a really big deal.
Yeah, I remember being at some shindig last year, mostly with Americans and French and people. And I had to stand up and do a little kind of 10 minutes. And afterwards at the lunch, I sat next to a young French chap who was a kind of, I don't know why he was there, but he was sort of smart, well-to-do kind of chap. And I guess he must have been in his mid-30s, something like that. Yeah. But he had that kind of very urbane kind of Frenchness. Sort of young French men, they just look really neat. And I said to him, he was talking about it, we got talking about the liberation and everything. And I was saying, but don't you kind of, is there not a little bit of rancor or bitterness about all the destruction and, the French civilians that lost their lives? And he went, no, absolutely not at all. He said, the sacrifice that was made to free us, it was worth it. It was a price that we had to pay. Yeah.
But that's like in Holland, where it's at least they're liberated.
Same with Arnhem, isn't it?
Exactly, but at least they're liberated in Normandy. I mean, in Arnhem they weren't really.
It's extraordinary.
Of course, the hunger
respect,
winter,
isn't it?
It's really amazing.
It's absolutely brilliant. It's really, really touching.
Very moving.
But Nicola Hooray says, "Tell us about the most ridiculous reenactors you spotted in Normandy." I think, we've all made jokes about, fat 50-year-old members of the 101st Airborne and stuff. But and then
to a glider.
And then when I was doing that kind of the figure by Kirsty Young was saying that she'd been around and she'd seen it and she wasn't sure how she felt about all these middle-aged men driving around in jeeps, sort of dressed up as stuff. And so we got chatting about it, and I think it's people want to get close to it. They want to feel it a bit.
Yes,
I sort of think it's okay. I think if that's what you want to do, that's absolutely
you kind of have
fine.
to give it the benefit of the doubt. It's the people turning up dressed as the other side that you have to say.
You worry about.
Yeah, not your day-to-day, mate.
They just want to feel it. They just want to have it's a connection.
Yeah.
You're putting on that kit. You're driving around in the Jeep, you're smelling the same smells. Of course, no one's shooting at you. Of course, it's not dangerous. There's not going to be mines around the corner and all that kind of stuff. But it's about that connection. I'm sure that's what it is, really.
Yeah. One disappointment, I couldn't find a clicker. And because I was trying to buy a clicker to annoy you with, because I brought one and I couldn't find it. And we went in a shop in Arundel.
They're all sold out.
And all the clickers are gone. And it was really not a crushing moment, but just certainly a moment of disappointment.
Yeah, I'm quite relieved. Literally the most annoying noise ever.
Should we do some questions?
We can do some questions.
Okay. So Nick asked about the reenactors. Simon Walker, and this is something actually we talked about when we were there. I have a question that I wondered about, although the answer is somewhat irrelevant. Was Pegasus Bridge taken at 0016 BST or French time, or whether the same time in 1944? Watches would have been synchronised in Blighty. Same question for all the other events that day. Well,
it's double summertime, British double summertime.
So it's Zulu, which is GMT, +2, isn't it?
+2, isn't it? Which is why the French do it at 11:30, because they're +1.
Yeah.
Even though they're ahead.
It's so confusing.
It is really confusing. Because I remember at the 70th, Arlette Gondry cracked open all the champagne at 11:30 p.m. on the 5th, not at 12:30 on the 6th. And I said, why? And she said, because that's the time it was in France on D-Day. So my brain started going, jing, 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 jing. I was thinking, but aren't you 1 hour ahead? And wouldn't it be... Anyway, I gave up.
Well,
but it is British double summertime.
It's British double summertime.
So it's Zulu +2.
It's Zulu +2. Zulu being GMT. And Zulu also, this is...
I just want to use Zulu more often.
This is like a conversation with my father.
Yeah, I know.
If we were on holiday. Because if we went sailing, you'd get the nautical almanac out with the tides. And you'd read in the tide time, and he would say, is that Zulu or Zulu +1? It says 4:15 here. Zulu or Zulu +1. And it tended to always be, if I remember rightly, in whichever nautical almanac it was, the times do tend to be, I think they're in GMT, but I just can't remember. And you're 12 and your dad needs the tide time now, which probably led to one occasion where we did ground the boat because I'd read the tides wrong. But there we are.
Yeah. Well, if you will go on about Zulu. That's really good. But anyway, that's what it was. Watches would have been synchronised in Blighty, yes.
Yes, and there's that
that
famous photograph of the Pathfinders from 22nd Independent Parachute Company synchronising their watches under the propeller of an Albemarle or something for the 4 guys together.
I mean, the interesting thing, there is no standard time until the railways come in.
That's right, yeah.
Which is just amazing.
Yes, noon in Bristol is different to noon in London because they're far enough apart on the longitude. Yeah.
I love that.
I think, well, of course it is. Time is literally relative. Let's make no mistake.
Yeah.
Before clocks came in, everyone knew that. Yes, it's trains that require timetables, isn't it?
Yes, but thank God, because I mean, otherwise, how would those of us who are obsessed with time? How would we have coped?
Well, you'd have to say Zulu +1, Jim. That's what you have to do.
Yeah, but you wouldn't know.
Well, I mean, when you add to that
the sun goes down behind the elm.
When you add that to the fact that I mean, whenever it was, all the diaries got realigned to tidy up the Gregorian calendar.
Yes, when was that? Like 1742.
Yeah, but the Russians didn't do it until after the revolution, did they? So their revolution happens in a different month to the month they say it does, right?
Yes, it's sort of in November or something.
Exactly.
Rather than February or October.
Exactly. It's totally so what's that? Zulu plus 1,000. Right, let's take a break and then we'll be back with another question. Thank you. We'll see you in a tick. Welcome back to We Have Ways to Make You Talk with me, Murray and James Holland. Our sort of D-Day wash-up. I mean, it could be a D-Day. We could be talking about the D-Ds as well, because after all, D-Day is a D-D. D-Day.
Yes.
I mean, D-Day for the D-Ds was D-Day.
Yes. And I'm going to the other D next.
Yes, Dunkirk.
Yeah.
Great, tremendous. Oh, you are great. Right, so questions. We have questions. We answered one in passing, then we've actually answered one, and now Dan Green has a question for us. Is the lack of preparation for the difficult blockage country because the Allies assumed the Germans would either beat them back into the sea or crumble and fall back much further? I think attempt to beat them back into the sea is what he means. I don't think they ever thought that the Germans would manage that, did they?
The reason they're not familiar with the bocage is there's a number of reasons for it. The first reason is that the priority for training was to make sure that the assault wasn't a failure.
Yeah.
And frankly, that does trump everything.
Yeah, of course it does.
That's the number one thing.
Yeah.
And it's potentially the most problematic, jumping out of landing craft.
It's all incredibly difficult.
Difficult and complicated, and you need to absolutely know exactly what you've got to do.
Yeah.
And the hardest thing is, as it turns out, it's not the hardest thing, but on paper, the kind of toughest challenge is getting through that crust.
Yeah.
Once you've got a foothold in Normandy, you're going to win.
Yeah.
Come what may, because the Allies have overwhelming amounts of men and material compared to the Germans. So the focus is on that. The second thing is that Britain, it's all being launched in Britain. Britain is a really, really small island. And the number of kind of multi-format, all-arms training grounds are really, really small. And
the ones that exist don't necessarily reflect the countryside in Normandy either, do they?
Exactly. Catterick, South Wales, Scotland.
Thetford for armoured training. Yeah,
all that. Yeah. So you have got Devon, but there isn't the infrastructure in Devon to allow you to do it. Yeah. And there isn't the scale and the size and the infrastructure to allow multiple units of millions of troops, artillery, armour, infantry, to all work together and train together in Britain. It's just not possible.
Yeah.
So you can't train for it. Then, of course, the other thing is the assumption is that the Germans will retreat in stages as they have done elsewhere.
Yeah.
And so that once they've got through the crust, the assumption is that the Germans would fall back to a much more easily defendable place, such as that huge long ridge line that we were looking at the other day. Oh, no, you weren't there on that bit, but the bit where you're, on the Sanlow Ridge, for example, and then even further south at the kind of objective of Bluecoat later on in the campaign. That makes more sense because it doesn't make any sense for anybody for the defenders, once the crust has been pierced, to remain within range of offshore naval guns. Allied naval guns.
But this takes us back to a conversation we were having in Normandy last week or last month, which was that this is why the deception to keep so many people in Norway is so critical, because it's where, I've now completely come around to the idea that the Germans should have defended on the beaches and not attempted to defend in a kind of second tier depth in Normandy to stymie the invasion, because its most fragile point is the landing. So if the crust's thicker, obviously then the Allies would have known, because the thing we know for sure is that we had a fair idea of what German strength was in Normandy. So they'd have amped it up. But there's a point where you can't amp it up any further. You can't land any more people.
You definitely want double bands of divisions over a shorter stretch.
Yeah.
To a kind of 12-mile depth.
But it reaches the point where the space becomes too congested. There isn't the shipping. So I'm saying if the Germans had put 100,000 men in Norway rather than, what is it?
Well, there's 76,000 when they're on D-Day within the vicinity of the invasion.
Exactly. So if
it were 176,000, then and you're already landing, and you're landing fewer than are already there.
Yeah, you're really in trouble.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah, I think. So it shows that they
pulled it off at Salerno, obviously.
Yeah, but all of this is super connected. I mean, the deception bodyguard is incredibly important for this operation because, you are in the too big to fail end of things. Certainly politically, the political stakes of D-Day failing are different to the political stakes of Anzio failing or Salerno failing, aren't they?
Yeah.
Because even though it isn't the second front, and there's that great Montgomery quote where he's going, they must admit all the other fronts I was at. The first front, the second front, the fourth front, whatever it is, right? You've staked so much on this politically that it's not just militarily, strategically, and operationally too big to fail. It's politically too big to fail.
Yeah.
The stakes are Soviet boots on the Champs-Elysees if you get this wrong. So it just shows how important the deception is to the fact that you end up fighting the Germans in the bocage. These things are actually directly related to one another.
Yeah.
And that your planning has to be get ashore, ink spots join up together.
Yep.
And then, not long after, you're doing Epsom is bigger than El Alamein in terms of an army effort.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Far bigger than El Alamein, and has been conjured up out of the ocean in a matter of 3-4 weeks, even with a storm.
Actually, I'm not sure that it is bigger than El Alamein, but it's big.
Well, competing with that. Alamein.
Yeah.
When El Alamein has a supply line at your back, has Alexandria port.
It's a point really well made, I think. But you're saying that happens
700 guns. 700 guns.
Yeah, it was 850 at Alamein.
Well, so comparable with El Alamein.
Comparable, yeah.
This is my point. Within 3 weeks, you've been able to conjure that up.
Yeah.
But that shows that it is the crust, because as you say, once they're ashore, they're ashore. There ain't going to be nothing
Well, as we were saying when we were doing Epsom, once you've won that one, there's no way back for the Germans. But just to go back to Dan's point about the bocage. The other thing is that even in 1944, the US Army is still new to war. It's not. It hasn't been in it 3 years at that point. So it's a tiny period.
Yeah.
And when it first goes into battle against the Germans or Axis forces in Northwest Africa in November 1942, so less than 2 years earlier, all of this is completely new.
Yeah.
And so they are learning the lessons as they go along. And as it happens, the US Army is just superb at learning lessons very, very quickly. But it's been in North Africa. It's been in Sicily. It's been in Italy. It's been in training grounds in North America. It's been in training grounds in Britain. It hasn't been in Europe.
And it's been fighting in the Far East as well.
Of course. Of course. So US Army in Guadalcanal. But they're not coming over to Pacific. They're not coming over to the UK, and the crossover from the Pacific to Europe is quite minimal. Small. It's Joe Lawton Collins switching sides, switching theatres, but that's literally about it. And from the British point of view, traditionally there's always been this thing that you make up. There's no tactical doctrine. You make it up as you go along. You adapt, and so that's one of the reasons why Monty wants to have experience alongside inexperience. So the experience they've got the kind of bedrock of experience. They've got that sixth sense. They've been in action. They know what to expect to a certain extent. But everyone in Normandy is learning this for the first time.
And he's keen on limiting what he's trying to achieve because he doesn't want to put people in a position where they find themselves overstretched and lose their confidence, which is central to how he, I know what my army's capable of and I'm not really going to ask anything more of it than that, and this adaptation culture on the go at the same time. So that by the end of the war, he's not really having to lean too heavily on anybody. They know what they're doing. Yeah. But at this stage, he is watching everyone like a hawk.
But if you think the Americans have only been in the war for 2.5 years and they've been in action for less than 2 years, and you think that the British Army 4 years and 2 days earlier went back across the channel with its tail between its legs with all its equipment gone, and it was tiny in the first place.
Yeah.
The learning curve for both the US Army and for the British Army has been absolutely enormous. And indeed the Canadians, who started from scratch.
Which is the greater transition? The British Army from abject defeat and ignominy, really. Yes, it's a miracle, Dunkirk, but it's a fairly well-qualified miracle. Or the American Army, its self-creation in that time?
Well, the truth is they're both really impressive and for different ways and because of a different journey.
Because the setback for the Americans is for the Philippines, isn't it? It's being thrown out to the Philippines.
Yes.
So they have also had their existential setback as well.
Yes, and they've had Kasserine, which they have beaten themselves up about far more than they needed to.
Well, unless they did need to beat themselves up that much in order to learn the lesson as good as they could. The penny to drop.
But my point is, when you're going back, why didn't they understand about the bocage? First of all, not the training space in Britain. B, the focus has to be on the invasion itself.
Yeah.
C, doctrine is constantly evolving.
Yeah.
And D, you have no idea where you're going to be fighting because they're just guesswork. The only bit you know where you're going to be fighting is on the beaches.
Well, and also, what we don't have is a Google Maps view of Normandy that we would have now. It's all what they've been able to piece together, isn't it? So actually knowing what the terrain is actually like.
Well, I remember, what's his name? Chick Bonesteel.
Chick Bonesteel.
He was on 21st Army Group planning and then 1st Army planning and had been on the Husky planning team. Yeah. He had experience he'd done loads and loads of research on that and had warned about the bocage. The point is they weren't really expecting to have to fight there because they were expecting them to go back in stages further back than that.
Yeah. You've also got, there are British soldiers who have experience of fighting in Normandy from 1940 as well.
Yes, of course. And also, the other bit is the other big bocage area where the Americans really come into bocage is the Cotentin Peninsula, which makes no sense for the Germans to defend whatsoever. Yeah. Really makes no sense at all. Yeah. And Rommel et al. Are going to Hitler, let us pull back or else we're just going to lose all these guys. He goes, no, we must fight for every yard and all the rest of it. But it's absolutely bonkers. And the other thing, I think the other point to make is the British come up against a bit of bocage on their right flank, but for the most part, they're not in bocage. It's only the Americans who are in bocage.
It's good tank country.
It's great tank country. British but the irony, of course, is that the Americans in the West Country, where there is also kind of lots of small fields of thick hedges in Devon and Cornwall and Dorset and what have you. And they're the ones who then get it on the other side.
But it's about getting ashore.
Yeah.
But the other point is...
that was a full answer.
The thing is, at Hill 192, they experienced a nightmare in the bocage and then go away, dust themselves down, coordinate their efforts, train and return with force and get the Fallschirmjäger off Hill 102. Okay, our next question is from John Tregonning, who will be speaking about medicine at Arnhem at WeHaveWaysPod.
Very strong.
Hopefully Rishi will stick around for that. that talk.
And we'd just like to welcome you all here, and for you, Rishi.
And John asks, how best to engage children with the story? And that's a good question, because when I got back, a little ragged from the ferry on Friday, we had a very good train journey.
Quite a big night, didn't you?
Yeah. Well, I was up, Joey and I were up drinking with men from 9 Squadron and 4 Para Battalion late, until well after the bar closed. And they were telling us all these stories about parachuting, none of which are all confidential. I will not divulge any of the details they gave us.
Any of
the secrets. But feet knees together, chin down, elbows in. Anyway, the point is, when I got home on Saturday, I sat down to watch the coverage with Daisy, my daughter, who's 6. And then you find yourself having to explain what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, what is it? And so you say, well, France. And she knows she's aware of the concept of France, of other countries, because we've been there a lot. So, well, France had been invaded by the Germans.
5 minutes in, you were saying, well, the problem with the Tiger Tank was...
And go, well, obviously the Meteor engine is...
And it's really important you understand the difference between an LST and an LSI.
Well, and what you see here is, exactly, the difference between the 77mm 17-pounder adaptation on the Comet. But no...
and she gazed at you lovingly.
She did what they all do. She glazed over. No, no. And we said, so it's to explaining to her that the Germans would make...
Daisy, what's that in Zulu time?
That I'm going to crack. The next time you see her, she'll be explaining the difference between Zulu and... Anyway, but we talked, he said, so the Germans were telling the French how to live their lives and they had no choice and all this sort of thing. And there was a big war and all this. And I think we managed to explain it to her. And when it must be 12 years ago now, I took my elder 2, Scarlett and Willow, for full proper brainwashing, took them to Normandy. We stayed just next to Aramanche. We did Omaha Beach. We did Saint-Mary-Église. We did Pegasus Bridge. We did the classics, Jim.
Yeah.
And what was interesting about that holiday was the museum at Saint-Mary-Église was the start of one of my moments where I thought I needed to stop thinking about the Second World War quite so much, because it was just a bit too razzmatazzy. And I was kind of thinking...
You had a few years off.
You had a few years off. I was thinking, I need a bit more pity of war in this presentation of things. And also, John Steele, come on.
Yeah. Anyway,
but I remember I was able to explain it to them. And I was able to explain the sort of, the scale of it. You show them, you show like a 12-year-old, or an 11-year-old, I think Scarlett was 11 at the time. You show them the mulberry and you can see their brain calculating it, and then go in the museum, the old, it would have been the old museum, show them what this is about. And it was sort of becoming clear to them. But getting them to pick up the ball and run into the things we've been talking about in the first half of this, about the bocage and operational level and the importance of deception and all this sort of stuff. And it wasn't a goer. But I don't know. I mean, I think it's doable. Or maybe it's the people doing the advocacy the important part rather than the children themselves, because children could pretty much be persuaded to be interested in absolutely anything.
Well, okay, so I think that whole relationship with your children and your own interests and reflecting onto them and all the rest of it, I think is really, really interesting. Because I remember when we were over with Ben Wilborn to Co the other day, Ben said, my younger son said to me, Daddy, I want to be a leg spinner. I was just like, oh my God, that's just brilliant. Yeah. And then he said, Dad, can you take me to Wales and teach me how to read an Ordnance Survey map? It's like, I dream of that day. I've tried so many. I go loads of walking holidays with my Daisy, and I go, please, can you just try and show a bit of interest in a map? She just goes, I'm just not interested. I don't care where we're going. You know how to do it.
Oh God.
So, but she loves walking, so that's a big tick. She's just not interested in converting that interest in walking into an Ordnance Survey map, which I find really odd. But she thinks it's really odd that I'm so obsessed with it.
Yeah.
But I think with children, I mean, one of the reasons why my brother and I are so into history is because my dad was, albeit completely vocationally. And so when we were kids, we spent our holidays going to Hadrian's Wall and the castles of North Wales.
Yeah.
And we didn't go to skiing or go to a chalet in, a sort of beach hut in France or something. And my dad wasn't really interested in the Second World War, apart from reading Douglas Riemann novels. So it just didn't really come up.
Yeah.
But he was obsessed with cricket in the 70s, and so therefore, so was I. Ned is not massively interested in the Second World War, but he loves cricket. So I kind of, I'll take that.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is most children, their outlook is incredibly narrow, and you don't give a flying toss about the rest of the world. I mean, you either get that kind of history bug and you're interested in kings and queens and knights and beheadings and, six wives and Second World War and Agincourt and stuff, or you're not. Yeah. And if you're not, then your horizons are just really small, aren't they? It's about, are you going to kind of pool this weekend? Are you, what party are you going to go to? Are you going to get into the first 11? Are you going to go out with your mates? That's your horizons. And I think the interesting thing about history, and this is why I never get particularly worried when the Daily Mail does a survey saying how appalling it is that only 12% of people know the difference between 1066 and 1940. It's like, honestly, I don't remember ever in my teenage years once being aware of D-Day.
Yeah.
I just wasn't aware of it. It didn't feature, if I did, I've forgotten all about it. I mean, it just wasn't on my radar in any shape or form. But I think the thing about history, unlike any other academic subject, it's very few people that take up physics at 29. Once you leave it at A level or GCSE or whatever, that tends to be it. But with history, as you get older, your horizons broaden and you start to want to kind of understand how you fit into this mad, crazy picture. And I don't know, in my case, it's the Spitfire over the cricket ground, but it could be any trigger, couldn't it? It could be an article you read, a book you look at, a documentary you see, a film, playing Call of Duty. It could be anything that just triggers that interest.
But the thing is, I agree completely with an element of this, which is that I'm not into football, right? So whenever there's a survey about people don't know about D-Day, I think, well, yeah, but I don't know about football. It's all right.
Yeah.
Because I
couldn't tell you who the kind of striker is from West Ham.
Exactly. But then it exists in another space, which is where we came from is where we're going, and our society is built on coagulated events that have gone by, and what we know about them, what we understand them, what they're actually like, what actually happened. In the end, that's the historian's job, is to parse that and find a way through to what seems to be the truth. But beyond that, if people aren't interested in it, I'm completely comfortable with people not being interested in history or not knowing about D-Day in the way I'm completely comfortable with I don't know what a quark is.
No.
Why would I?
No.
Although you could argue the difference is physics is why your car works, but you could argue that history is why the car got invented. So they have to sit along.
It's a broad church history.
It is. It's extremely broad church. But you know what I mean? How you get a kid interested in it though? You just do your best.
Well, I still think that the reason why anyone gets interested in the Second World War is because of the very, very intense human drama, and it was something that was experienced by our forebears and by people who came before us, so people like us. Yeah. And so it's that peculiarity of something that seems so extraordinary, confronting ordinary people.
But again, to go back to when we were talking earlier, that's what was so good, I thought, about that commemoration thing. It's because it was about people like us. Those lads would have listened to Johnny Flynn's music if they'd been 19.
Yeah.
Then,
and incidentally, what an amazing song that is!
That just brilliant? Or they didn't love Tom Jones because their nan loved Tom Jones.
Yeah.
Because I always think this is sometimes
make it relevant.
No, it's not even that. Make it real. Because the problem often with the presentation of the First World War and then the Second World War is that it was fought by old people. It wasn't fought in black and white by hordes of people on Zimmer frames. It was fought by... But
I think it's fascinating,
know what I mean?
that every time these conversations come around periodically, particularly at an anniversary, everyone sort of goes, is that it? This is finally everyone's going to lose interest in the Second World War. I think what's really interesting is that lots of people had already lost interest in the Second World War and it's been revived.
Yeah.
And it's been revived in a massive way in the last 10, 15 years.
And it's changed. Because, people were talking about what used to happen at Pegasus Bridge in the old days is 40 years ago, everyone would gather there. And also what would happen is people would turn up in red berets and no one would recognise them. Who the hell are you? And it was people like trying to join in or trying to get some stolen valour or whatever. There's been that too in the mix.
Yeah.
But it used to be they'd all sit round, have a pint, maybe with their wives, maybe with some, Hans von Luck would turn up and make friends, and all that, a completely different memorial commemoration culture to what we have now. But
the interesting thing is that, if there was a veteran there at Pegasus Bridge on the 5th of June, I'm sure no one saw them. Or if they did, it only seemed. But the vast majority of people there were not there because there were lots of veterans there. They're there because they just wanted to be a part of it. And that makes me think that once the veterans are gone, I think it's still going to be a cause of enormous taxation. Yes, but the other thing is that what's really interesting is the fact that kind of children don't know about it. Young folk know about it now because they play Call of Duty, but also because on Netflix there's World War II and Cold War.
Yeah.
And that really changes things.
Yeah.
And has changed things.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that has ticked a box.
Yeah.
And there's still enough toys and Jeeps and trucks and stuff to play around in.
Yeah.
To also give it that kind of that tactile connection, I think.
Yeah. Right. Well, that's all for this week, for this episode. Thanks very much for listening. Those of you who've subscribed to the Apple channel, Officer Class, thank you very much for joining in and skipping the ads. And all of the Patreons on We Have Ways Patreon, thanks for being a part of this as well. And we will see you, we hope, at We Have Ways Fest. This goes out before We Have Ways Fest, isn't it, Joe? So we will see you all at We Have Ways Fest. If not, now's the time to buy a ticket. Time's running out. WeHaveWaysFest.co.uk for a weekend of continued war waffle of the highest quality, and maybe a glance at the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister. But
who knows?
Who knows? Thanks very much for listening. Cheerio.
Cheerio.